Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on a really fascinating text, the Revelation of Moses, which is often, looked at alongside the life of Adam and Eve. It's a crucial piece of ancient literature because it gives this incredibly expanded view of the Genesis story, almost like a forensic account of what happened right before Adam and Eve's expulsion, especially the tiny details, the mechanics of the fall itself.
Exactly. And I think this material is so valuable because it really goes beyond just, Genesis saying a serpent deceived Eve. Instead, it gets into the specific how and why it actually worked. It talks about the devil and the serpent working together, and it even defines let's say, the payload of the act, both physically and spiritually.
Right. And that level of detail forces us really to grapple with a pretty fundamental question about what the first sin actually was. So our central question today is this: was the main driver, the essential thing that caused the fall, was it the devil's really elaborate, carefully planned external deception? The plotting, the disguise, the psychological games, or was it the immediate internal corrupting agent, this poison of wickedness that the text says was put right onto the fruit?
And I'll be arguing that the definitive mechanism here was the introduction of that very specific physical and spiritual poison of wickedness, which interestingly the text identifies as desire. So this really highlights internal moral corruption as the truly consequential cause.
And I'm going to argue that the fall was primarily kicked off and frankly successfully carried out because of the devil's complex strategic planning and psychological deception. It really maximizes the role of that external agency to make sure the covenant was broken. I think the outcome just wouldn't have happened without those sophisticated methods. Okay, so when we really dig into the narrative, the text puts a huge emphasis on the planning, the complexity of the devil's, external malice. This wasn't just, seeing an opportunity and taking it. This was a thought-out plan. Chapter 4 lays out this strategy very clearly, almost like military steps. First, the devil makes a pact with the serpent, telling it exactly how to be his tool for deceit, even flattering its intelligence so it would cooperate. But the really critical phase, I think, is Satan's calculated move to show up in the form of an angel. That's chapter 4, verse 12. And this happened specifically while the real holy angels, the legitimate divine authorities, were away worshiping. This disguise was absolutely essential. It created this false sense of authority, of trust, which was needed to get past Eve's, initial fear of God, her covenantal loyalty. And that deception then laid the groundwork for the lie that followed, that God basically held a grudge and was keeping them from becoming as gods. That's verse 21. So you see, this isn't just simple temptation. It's a carefully constructed, almost political manipulation, specifically designed, as the text says, to entice and destroy in chapter 5, verse 2. The external strategy, the deception, it's undeniably the primary driver that opened the door.
I definitely acknowledge the sheer complexity of the deception presented. It's quite striking. But I come at it from a slightly different angle regarding sort of the priority of these elements. While deception certainly set the stage, the text is remarkably precise, I think, in defining the actual substance of the sin. And it seems to place that substance above the method used to deliver it. Chapter 5, verse 5 is incredibly explicit. It says the serpent put upon the fruit, the poison of his wickedness, that is, of his desire, for desire is the head of all sin. Now, that definition, it doesn't sound like just a metaphor for lying. It sounds like the naming of an active corrupting agent, something that introduces a fundamental spiritual, maybe even physical disease. And the immediate consequence really supports the idea that the substance is key. Eve's eyes were opened physically, and she instantly knew she was stripped of the righteousness with which she had been clothed. That's chapter 5, verse 7. This points to a kind of ontological change, right? A fundamental shift in their very nature caused directly by consuming the poison. So if the text itself identifies this corruption, this desire, as the head of all sin, then surely that internal change has to be the definitive result, regardless of the external packaging the devil used to sell it.
I see the power in focusing on desire like that, I do. But I have to push back on the necessity of the deceptive means. Okay, I grant that the poison is the active agent that causes the change, but could that poison have actually been consumed if the elaborate strategy hadn't worked? The narrative makes it pretty clear that Eve was initially obedient. She was fearful. It explicitly says she feared God's anger. That's chapter 4, verse 19. The deception, and especially that angelic disguise, seems absolutely required to overcome that foundational faithful fear. Satan basically weaponized trust by impersonating the very beings who represented divine authority. It was necessary, I think, to break that covenant bond and make her willing not just to eat, but then to swear an oath promising she'd give it to Adam too. So the strategy was primary. It successfully got around her free will and her religious conviction.
The poison, in this view, is really just the destructive payload. It's delivered effectively because the external plot succeeded. If that disguise had failed, if Eve hadn't been convinced, the fruit would have stayed on the tree, and the poison would have been, well, inert.
I don't think I'd say the means were less significant, but I would challenge the idea that the deception dictates the fundamental essence of what the fall is. That's a strong point about deception creating the opportunity, sure, but have you thought about the theological weight the text gives to defining the poison of wickedness, specifically as desire, and then going further to declare desire itself as the head of all sin? That's chapter 5, verse 5 again. That kind of hierarchical language, head of all sin, it points to something more than just an opportunity. It suggests an internal state that now governs all subsequent sin. So the original sin in this reading is the successful introduction of this governing state. And if the ultimate problem that God addresses later is this corruption of the heart, which seems clear from the promise in chapter 3, verse 15, to give a heart made to understand what is good, then the actual mechanical introduction of the poison looks like the definitive mechanism of that moral corruption and separation from God. The deceit was maybe a masterful sales pitch, yeah? But the sale itself was the transfer of this corrupting spiritual disease.
And let's look specifically at how Adam fell, because I think that process really strengthens the case for the internal agent being primary. Adam's compliance, it seems much less dependent on some kind of strategic external deception compared to Eve's, quite lengthy and calculated encounter with the disguised devil. The text says that immediately after eating, Eve herself becomes an agent of wickedness. She actually states, as soon as Adam came, I opened my mouth, and the devil spoke.
He says, I fear I shall fall into the judgment of God. But Eve very quickly persuades him, saying, Fear not, as soon as thou eatest, thou shalt rest. That's verses 16 and 17. Now, this incredibly rapid persuasion, it suggests the immediate, almost infectious and transmissible nature of the wickedness, the desire that was now working through Eve, the direct product of the poison. Adam seems to fall not because a disguised angel tricked him, but because this internal corruption had now infected the person closest to him. That seems to confirm the poison as the active, transmissible force.
Okay, while that explains the outcome very effectively, I think it sidesteps the mechanism that put Eve in that position to begin with. I have to insist that Eve was only functioning as the devil's instrument because the original strategic deception was successful. Her ability to then quickly persuade Adam, basically using their intimate relationship against him, well, that just confirms the ultimate success of the devil's calculated goal from the start. Chapter 4, verse 8 says, his plan was to use the wife to get the man kicked out. The devil didn't need a second, complex plot for Adam. The first one did the trick. The initial, very intricate planning, the pact, the angelic disguise, the successful psychological breakdown of Eve's faith, that whole sequence set the entire engine of ruin in motion. The physical passing of the fruit was just the final step, the culmination of that successful external plot. If the devil's deception hadn't worked on Eve first, Adam would never have been exposed to this internal transmissible agent you're talking about. And Adam's very first reaction, remember, O wicked woman, why hast thou wrought mischief in us? Chapter 5, verse 18. That sounds like he recognizes the external agency working through the person who acted first. The planning was the absolute prerequisite for the infection to even start spreading. And to further underscore the primacy of this external agency, let's just look briefly at the judgment God delivers. It's highly instructive. The most severe, the most detailed curse by far is placed on the serpent, and it focuses heavily on its role as an ungracious instrument used specifically to deceive those that were remiss in heart. That's chapter 6, verse 23. The consequences for the serpent itself losing its limbs, having to eat dust, becoming despised by everything. Chapter 6, verses 24-25, this is a very specific, very humiliating punishment that targets the act of deception and the serpent's role as the means, the tool of the plot. God's focus here seems quite punitive, making sure the external actor who pulled off the deception is stripped of its former glory. This curse specifically targets the instrument and the method, which seems to confirm the primary importance of the strategic deceit that led to their banishment in chapter 7.
I have to disagree that the judgment primarily indicts the method over the result. I'm sorry, but I just don't see how the serpent's humiliation carries more weight than the immense suffering imposed on humanity itself. The judgment on Adam and Eve seems centered entirely on the deep consequences of the desire and disobedience that fundamentally altered their being and their entire world. Think about their punishments. They reflect this loss of glory, this corruption of their physical and relational nature. They get 70 strokes of disease. Chapter 2 talks about that. Eve gets crushing pain in childbirth. Chapter 6, verses 17-18. Adam loses his lordship over creation. Chapter 6, verse 21. And crucially, the curse extends even to the ground itself, making it produce thorns and thistles. Chapter 6, verse 13. These aren't just penalties. They're described as fundamental physical and relational changes stemming directly from that internal state of corruption introduced by the poison, by desire. It seems the world itself reacts to their internal state of sin. This confirms for me that the poison is the actual root cause of mortality, suffering, and the life of unbearable pains they're sentenced to. The punishment reflects the change in their core capacity, not just the lie they happen to fall for. Think about their punishments. They reflect this loss of glory, this corruption of their physical and relational nature.
Well, the intricate narrative of the fall in the revelation of Moses certainly underscores the powerful, the premeditated, and definitely the strategic nature of external evil. The whole sequence we've discussed, the pact, the disguise, breaking that covenantal fear, extracting the oath, it really demonstrates that the transgression was successfully engineered by a masterful deceiver. And that meticulous planning feels like the necessary condition for the fall to happen, making the strategic external agency primary, I think, for its success.
And yet the text itself gives us what feels like the definitive key to the nature of the transgression by naming that substance the serpent introduced, the poison of his wickedness, that is, of his desire. And by identifying desire specifically as the head of all sin, the text seems to reveal that the ultimate consequence, mortality, suffering, the need for redemption later on, it all stems from this internal corruption of the will. That change in their internal capacity feels like the true root of their plight. And it's the mechanism that even made the sin transmissible to Adam.
It's clear that the debate over whether the fall is primarily defined by, the strategic breach of trust orchestrated from outside or the almost metaphysical corruption of the will from inside really highlights the incredible theological depth of this material. Both the calculated malice of the deceiver and the tragic failure of the newly corrupted human heart are absolutely central to this unique account of the fall.
Indeed. This ancient text really pushes us to understand not just who tempted humanity, but what fundamental internal failure resulted from that temptation. It forces us to grapple with that very complex relationship between external means and internal corruption. There's certainly a lot to unpack here.